Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Krueger, State Senator from the 28th District. Welcome to another one of my virtual town halls, tonight discussing rent issues within housing in the city of New York. I'm just going to remind everybody of some things I just can't say enough anymore. I am delighted you are able to join us and hope you are staying safe. Wear a mask when you go outside or are going to be near other people who you don't traditionally quarantine with. Keep at least 6 feet apart and wash your hands over and over again until you think they're going to fall off. That's the right answer. On the mask issue, the weather's gotten beautiful out. People want to be outside and they want to feel like it's normal, but we're not at normal yet, and you need to wear your mask. I just came back from a couple of days in Albany, and to be honest, I was appalled that my Republican colleagues decided to come to the floor of the Senate without masks. And it was clearly intentional in some symbolic protest. But I have to tell you, protest however you like, but not by putting yourself and other people's lives at risk. So please, keep wearing the masks, keep 6 feet apart, keep washing your hands. Before we get to tonight's topic, I want to briefly touch on one other subject. My office has received hundreds of calls and emails each month since the pandemic began from constituents who are struggling to obtain the unemployment benefits that they're eligible for. And there are 3 different kinds now. While the Department of Labor has revamped its computer system and added thousands of additional workers, there are unfortunately still significant backlogs. I worked with the Community Service Society to create a video which is available on my website addressing many of the most frequently asked questions about regular and pandemic unemployment. The Department of Labor has also expanded the list of FAQs on its website. If you are having problems and you live in my district, with unemployment or other public benefits, please feel free to contact my office for help, 212-490-9535, or by email at lkrueger, Krueger, Lkrueger, at nysenate.gov. Remind people who have called to remain on mute. Oh, that's the instructions to me. Some people are watching on Facebook, and some people have called in because they prefer a phone system. Everybody on phones, please, please, please mute yourself. This is not the kind of virtual town hall where you get to speak. You may, if you're on Facebook, ask questions via typing them in. But if you're on the phones and you didn't get the questions to us in advance, your options are limited. Although we have so many excellent questions, I bet we've already got the question that you wanted to ask. You'll see. Oh, it's 7 o'clock because I'm hearing the shouting outside my window in honor of the first responders. There's somebody who likes to hit pots and pans by me also. So this is the first of a 2-part series I'm holding on New York City housing issues during the pandemic. Tonight I'm being joined by tenant attorney extraordinaire Ellen Davidson from the Legal Aid Society, who will discuss many of the issues and questions facing renters in the midst of the pandemic. And at the same time next week, I'll be hosting an event with 2 attorneys focused on the questions and concerns of co-op shareholders, condo owners, and small homeowners, because I've got everybody in my district. I think, in retrospect, as we get past the scariest health concerns of the pandemic, what is going to haunt us next is the reality that we are going to be facing probably the biggest housing crisis the city of New York has seen, perhaps since the Great Depression of the 20s. We were already facing a housing crisis as the economy was going up strongly and as we had actually tried to improve the housing protections in our laws and expanded the number of affordable units compared to earlier years, and yet we were still in a crisis. We were already facing larger numbers of homeless New Yorkers than we had seen since the Great Depression. And now, within a few weeks, almost overnight, we are seeing a reality where our unemployment rate has tripled at minimum. We don't even know the real numbers yet. And the reality facing so many listening out there tonight, and people you and I both know, is that they don't have the money to pay their rent. They've lost their jobs. The future is very uncertain about which jobs are coming back and when, and will they be available to the same people here in New York who had them before. So we're really at a moment where we don't have all the answers. We're facing many, many complicated issues at once, and it is truthfully overwhelming our governments, both in the ability to operationally take care of things and in relationship to lack of budget revenue to cover costs that are being exacerbated every day because you have to pay for this enormous healthcare pandemic. You need to pay for the unemployment that people need to continue to survive and take care of themselves and their families. And then you also need to somehow help with their housing costs. But we don't have enough of programs to take care of the rental crisis that we know we're going to face. So we're literally on the verge of an explosion that we haven't gotten our arms around what we're going to do. So we have a desperate need for substantial federal housing assistance. And we're not sure we're going to get it. The House of Representatives has passed a bill, I believe 2 Fridays ago, that commits $100 billion of federal money to housing assistance for low-income people who can't afford their rent and or their mortgages because of what's been going on in the pandemic and the economic crisis. The estimate from that bill, if it became law, was that New York State could see as much as $10 billion of assistance for housing, for rent, and mortgage assistance. But it's not here yet because the U.S. Senate has not taken up this bill, and it's not clear whether or not they're going to. So in an attempt to try to build in some protections, we were in Albany again today, passing bills in both houses that try to offer some relief and assistance to people while we're waiting for the federal government to send us the money we need. 2 important bills I want to mention to you that we did pass in both houses is the Tenant Safe Harbor Act, S8192B, and that would prohibit a warrant of eviction and possessory judgments from being issued in the courts in non-payment cases against resident tenants who have lost income or suffered other financial hardship during the covered pandemic period. This covered period is defined as beginning March 7, 2020, and ending once a long list of executive orders restricting business, public accommodations, and non-essential gatherings has been lifted. Landlords can only obtain money judgments against tenants who have lost income during the COVID time period, but they cannot evict people for not being able to pay the rent during that time period. Now, that's huge. It doesn't mean you don't owe the money, but it means you can't be evicted on the basis of not being able to pay the money because you don't have it. Now, it doesn't address the fact that we need to make sure there is money so that people can pay their rent and so that landlords can get paid and not watch their buildings collapse because revenue's not coming in. But it is a critical step, and I do want to thank the Legal Aid Society for working with me and my colleagues to explain why this kind of legislation would be so important, and We did get it passed, and I believe that the governor will sign it. The second bill that we also just passed, I believe in both houses today, was the Emergency Rent Relief Act of 2020, S8419. And this establishes an emergency voucher program for tenants who experience an increase in their rent burdens due to the loss of income and pending pandemic. In order to be eligible for some rental assistance, tenants must have income below 80% of the area median income set by HUD, and they must have paid more than 30% of their incomes as rent prior to March 7th and at the time of the application for emergency assistance. And they also have to have lost income due to the pandemic. So it's a relatively limited but extremely poor and vulnerable population who can be eligible for this assistance. And in fact, we only put $100 million behind this bill because that's all we have right now. And there was a fight to get the governor to commit the $100 million. So if I'm telling you we're counting on the federal government for $10 billion, and right now we're starting off with $100 million, I think you can see where we need to get to versus where we are. Some facts that I think it's important to keep in context as you're hearing the answers from Ellen and as I ask her the questions. Even before the pandemic, almost half of all New York City renters were rent burdened, meaning they were paying more than 30% of their income in rent, and more than 25% were severely rent burdened, paying 50% of their income in rent. This leaves little money for other basic expenses and made saving for an emergency nearly impossible. More than a third of New York City households are currently experiencing job losses. With the worsening economic conditions, more and more people are increasingly struggling to pay their rent and for food. Some are resorting to really bad decisions, taking out payday loans and skyrocketing their credit card debt to keep a roof over their heads and buy food. Hundreds of thousands of New York City residents, including many living in my district on the east side of Manhattan, are literally struggling to pay their rent or facing food insecurity for the very first time in their lives. The delays many residents are facing obtaining unemployment benefits has made everything even worse. And again, as I mentioned, we're still waiting for the federal money we desperately need to help with housing and other basic needs. I want to make sure people know there are other benefits available. SNAP is a terrific program to assist you to buy food for your family, and they've made SNAP eligibility easier for people who are newly unemployed due to the pandemic. So while we're not doing a town hall on food programs again, we have one from a couple of weeks ago. I want to make sure that people know that there are about 30 different government benefits they might be eligible for that could help them get through this tough time. All right, with that, I think we're just about ready to bring on Ellen Davidson, who's not going to actually make a presentation tonight because she is aware of all the questions because we went over them together in advance, and I think she feels like everything she wants to talk about, she will have an opportunity to do just by answering the questions. So again, her name is Ellen Davidson, a longtime staff attorney with the New York City Legal Aid Society's Law Reform Unit, who specializes in rent-regulated housing and has been a long-time tenant advocate who is here with us tonight. And at another time, I'll tell you a story about why Ellen and I know each other from even before we were both doing what we do now. You'll have to ask me next time you actually see me in person. But again, we've received dozens of questions in advance. We tried to put them into groups so that we are having sort of a discussion around specific issues side by side. And with that, thank you, Ellen, so much for joining us tonight. It's so nice to see you even just over Zoom. And I'm just going to start us off. Did you put your mic on?
Yes, I did.
Excellent.
Mhm.
Good. Just wanted to test that. Okay.
Yes.
So I think biggest fear out there. Can my landlord take me to housing court now if I can't pay my full rent? And what about after June 20th? And
Yeah.
can my landlord send me notices threatening to evict me if I don't pay my rent during this moratorium period? So if you could explain a little bit about the moratorium we're living under.
Yeah. And I apologize, it's a tad bit complicated. So back in March, the governor issued an executive order, and he said all cases in housing court have to stop. If you had a pending case, stop coming to housing court. For anyone who's ever been to housing court, hundreds of people a day end up piling in. It's a very bad, situation during this health crisis. So he said, we're stopping all housing court cases from going forward, and we're also going to stop all evictions and all new cases being filed. And that moratorium, that moment of pause, will go until June 20th. So that's the date that's in people's heads. Um, then the governor, a couple of weeks ago, put on a press conference and he said, I'm extending the moratorium until August 20th. And then about 12 hours later, the actual executive order came out. And I think you might not be shocked to hear that what was in the news headlines was not exactly what was in the new executive order. So that executive order is limited to people who are either on unemployment benefits or have received a COVID-related financial hardship and are being sued in a case around non-payment of rent. For those of you who are unregulated tenants and are worried that your landlord is going to simply not renew your lease because you can't afford your rent, this moratorium does nothing for you. And so there is a very broad moratorium till June 20th, and then after that, a much narrower one. But I have to mention that there's a third moratorium, and it comes from the federal government, and it actually comes from the Federal CARES Act. And it's actually broader than people know. First of all, that moratorium goes until July 25th. And it's for all the usual suspects, public housing, people with Section 8 vouchers, project-based Section 8, but it also includes low-income housing tax credit buildings and any building where the owner has received loans from Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae. And I've sent your office a database from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that allows you to look up by zip code, by address, the buildings to see if your building comes under this. If you fall under the federal moratorium, not only do you have is it longer, but then your landlord has to give you 30 days notice before he can bring a case against you. As to whether your landlord can send you threatening notices, sadly, the answer is yes. Nothing that the governor said or did says that a landlord can't say you owe rent, and if you don't pay, I'm going to evict you, even though right now he can't. But the landlord is allowed to send notices, and I know that it causes people tremendous amount of, it makes people very, very, very nervous. And we unfortunately can't stop that.
Because of the Tenant Safe Harbor Act that passed, and we are
Yes,
confident the governor will sign, can we just clarify that
that's
while
right.
the landlords can continue to send notices, they really can't evict you based on these scenarios, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Sorry, I'm in New World. Let's see the governor signs it. But yes, when you are sued for non-payment of rent, if you do not pay, the landlord gets what's called a possessory judgment, which means he simply has the right of possession. And that's what allows the eviction process to happen. If you get evicted because you haven't paid rent, the landlord can and most likely will still go after you for a money judgment. You still owe the money. So all this, the Safe Harbor Act does, but I think it's important for this moment, it says that the landlord can't evict you if you can't pay. The money is still owed, and we need a solution to that. But it will extend the time that people aren't evicted, which in this crisis, being homeless has caused, that is the amount of infection of this disease in the homeless population is so much larger than the people who are housed, that preventing people from being homeless is a way of preventing the virus from coming back.
Right, it's critical so that it's not just your safety of having a home and a bed and a place to be. It's also protecting the rest of us from your ending up in a situation where you're much more likely to get sick and become a greater risk for all of us. So it's actually a win-win for all New Yorkers when we make sure that people are not being thrown out of their homes because of this crisis that we're now facing. So here's a question. I lost my job, but my wife is still working. Should we pay some of our rent if we still can? And what are our protections if we are in this situation and in a market rate apartment?
I mean, what's tricky about being in a market rate apartment, and I usually like to use the term unregulated versus regulated. If you are unregulated, you just don't have the tenant protections that other people have. The most important of those being the right to a renewal lease. And so I don't, depending on how long your lease is, once your lease is up, your landlord can choose not to renew it. And during this crisis, the landlord could choose not to renew it because there are so many obstacles being put in place for the landlord to bring cases against people for non-payment of rent. So you certainly have notice. The landlord has to give you a certain amount of notice before you can do such a thing, and that time frame has been lengthened from the law that was passed last year. So if you've been in your apartment for more than 2 years, the landlord must give you 90 days notice of non-renewal of your lease. I think, but it's hard to give advice about what people should choose to spend their money on. Just to be honest, people are struggling to figure out, do I go hungry? Do I pay my rent? I was talking to some advocates who are working with Uber drivers who are paying their insurance because they want to be able to go back to work as soon as possible. And if they let their insurance lapse, they can't go back to work. They can't drive again. And so people are making choices that are best for their family, and there is no one right answer. Right now, there's a moratorium. A landlord can't bring a case, and that might put tenants give the tenants an opportunity to negotiate with the landlord. To the extent you negotiate with the landlord that you're going to make partial payments because that's what you can afford, I just urge you to put the agreement in writing, so that if the landlord sues you and says, I don't know what you're talking about, you can show what you've agreed to. The other thing you should know is because of the way that the governor's executive order specifically talks about people who are either on unemployment or have suffered a COVID-related financial hardship, we are advising our clients to send their landlords a letter simply as saying, I have had a financial hardship because of COVID, which should mean that the landlord can't even start to bring a case against you.
Well, that's a good idea. I mean, even if you're not a client of Legal Aid Society,
Yeah.
To go on record with your landlord to write that. Yes, if you are able to negotiate paying part of your rent now, make clear that that was an agreement with the landlord so that that's not used against you. And even depending on the honesty of your relationship with your landlord, frankly ask, if you're a market rate tenant, are they planning to offer you a new lease if you are in difficult times right now? And if they tell you, no, I understand what's going on and you're going to try, yeah, I don't see a reason not to offer you a new lease at this time, you might feel more comfortable trying to do a rent negotiation with them versus if you know that they're just going to throw you out at the end of the lease period. I'm not sure how much effort you should be going through in trying to negotiate um, a solution on a very short-term situation. And what we are hearing is all over the place because some landlords understand that people are breaking their leases and leaving New York, and they're not so sure that they can rent again. They're not so sure they can rent again at as higher rents as they've been charging before. So some people who I think understand the housing market and are in it for the long term may very well be reasonable about renegotiating with you. But as you just pointed out, you got to get everything in writing. Here's the next question. I heard I can use my security deposit to pay my rent. Is this true?
Yes, that's actually part of the governor's executive order. But what it says, and it's not as simple sometimes as it seems, is that you can use your security deposit to pay your rent. However, within 90 days of you using your security deposit, you have to start making payments to end up having the security deposit back in the hands of your landlord. And the payments you have to make are 1/12, like a month, like what a monthly payment of the entire amount is. 1/12 of the security deposit until you fully repaid the security deposit. And there, this is important. And there, occasionally we see emails on what landlords are advising their clients to do. And some landlords' lawyers are saying that if someone misses this payment, this may be a reason to bring them to court to evict them. So it's something you can do, but you should be thoughtful about it.
Got it. Now, if I'm late in paying my rent during the pandemic because I've lost income or one of us was in the hospital the whole time, can my landlord charge me late fees because I'm late in paying the rent?
No, that's part of the same executive order that said that the governor said that through August, you can't be charged late fees for not being able to pay your rent.
Okay, that's good news.
Yes.
My roommate left due to COVID, and I'm not sure if I can get a new one at this time. Do I still have to pay the landlord the full rent? Both my name and my prior roommate's name are both on the lease.
When you have two people who are on the lease, they are both responsible for the entire rent. That's just the way the law works. And so the way the landlord wants his entire payment. And that the fact that the roommate has left doesn't mean that the person who remains isn't responsible for the full rent. So unfortunately, the answer is yes. If you want to stay in the apartment, there needs to be a plan on how the full rent can be paid. And to the extent you can find another roommate, that's what I would recommend doing.
Okay. So going back to the question of paying a part of the rent and your recommendation that you get an agreement in writing. So somebody typed into the Facebook, knowing my landlord will not likely respond to an email offering to negotiate a lower amount, should I just send a portion of the rent for each month I'm behind and explain in an email that I'm paying X% of that month due to COVID? Is that good enough because it's only a one-way, statement as opposed to something signed by the landlord or acknowledged by the landlord?
Yeah, it's just not a deal. I mean, a landlord who has a rent stabilized tenant who's willing to pay a portion to get something and work out a deal, and who's unwilling to respond to a tenant's email, I mean, that is not a landlord who is acting like a good business person.
Okay.
Not that that's surprising. So I think the answer is it won't protect you if your landlord sues you. But as we've talked about, the landlord can't sue you and evict you at this time. And I would just keep very careful records of what you are paying. Someone asked, what if they take the money you pay and put it toward previous rents? I would, the if you're paying your landlord by check or money order, I would put the note on the check what month it's for, and so the landlord has to attribute that money and can't to that month and can't say I'm going to use it for this month or that month. So I would just keep very careful records, and as I said, in the payment I would indicate what month the payment is for.
Got it. All right, so this is a variation. I've been withholding my rent since the beginning of the pandemic because I've heard the government may decide that tenants don't need to pay their rent or all of their rent during this period. How long can I get away with withholding my rent? And if I pay everything at the end in a lump sum, once a decision has been made about whether there's any government help or not, can the landlord evict me or have grounds for taking me to court? Are they obligated to take my payment in full and leave it at that? And that sort of implies that the person really does have the ability to pay their rent, but have just decided that it might get paid by somebody else if they don't. But I think that's how it's a slightly different storyline. What do you think, Ellen?
So I'm going to answer the legal question. I mean, I'll just say as an observation, there are some bills to cancel rent at the moment, and there's a movement to do it. At the moment, those bills don't seem to be moving. There's both the legislature and the governor, and nothing the governor has done makes me all that confident that he is looking out for tenants and wants to make sure that they're in a good place. So I'll just say that. But on the legal question, so if you've decided to withhold rent to see if cancel rent gets passed and your rental obligation is canceled, I would just urge you that you keep that money aside and make sure you don't spend it because unexpected expenses come up. To the extent your landlord then sues you for non-payment of rent, you won't have the excuse that you had a financial hardship and you won't be covered by any of these moratoriums. However, if you come to court with the entire rent that is owed, the landlord does have to accept that rent and has to end the case. So you will be protected.
Okay.
Obviously, it is better if you're in a better place if you're a rent-stabilized tenant and do this, and not unregulated tenant, because you might end up with a landlord not renewing your lease.
So, and I guess I'll ask the question in the context of now we have safe harbors, which we didn't have before today. So if New York City starts to reopen, let's say next month in June, how will this affect renters who are still struggling to pay the rent and or have not received unemployment benefits yet and or don't suddenly get their job back with the same amount of income? So the clock has started to tick, I guess, on no longer being exempt from a safe harbors perspective. What do we think the answer is for people like this? Because I think there are a lot of them. They're going to be a lot.
No, I will say, when you talk about this being a crisis and there are all these institutions that have been unable to rise up to meet the crisis, I will say that the court system is yet another one. So the courts are reopening now, even though there's this moratorium in place. But the courts have not figured out what to do about the fact that for most of the courts, certainly Manhattan, Bronx, and Brooklyn, it means bringing hundreds of people a day into very close quarters, which no one thinks is the right thing to do. So the courts have decided to, part of what I'm saying, part of why I want to mention this is the courts are very backed up. So landlords are going to bring cases, but it's going to be hard to move them through. The other difficulty is that if a tenant is unrepresented by counsel, the courts have yet to really put into place a way for tenants without lawyers to participate in legal cases. They're setting up all these systems if you have for cases with two lawyers. But right now they're saying they're not going to default people for not showing up. And a lot of people, I suspect, will simply not have the ability to show up online because they won't have the bandwidth. They won't have the minutes on their phone. They are limited English proficiency and will have no way to participate in their case as they call into some Skype for business. And so I think it's a very scary moment. But because of the backlog, I don't think it's happening quickly.
So we have a bunch of questions on renegotiating rents, and I'm just curious with what you just said about the reality of the courts. Does the court have a role in helping you to renegotiate a rent because you have less money and you are trying to convince your landlord that he should allow you to renegotiate what you owe because of what's been going on? And you can get a hold of him, perhaps because he's bringing you to court. Is that one of the things that can be done within the context of someone sending you threatening letters, or you're ultimately being called in to have to go to court?
So, I've been a housing attorney for almost 20 years. I've never seen the court help a tenant renegotiate their lease. Having said that, we've never been in a situation like we are, and sometimes judges do tell parties the hard truth. And the hard truth here is that even if every landlord evicts every tenant who hasn't paid, there's no one to replace them. So they're not getting their money. Mm-hmm. And so it might be a situation where judges sit landlords, I've certainly seen landlords sit tenants down and say, you're getting evicted. They have no problem doing that. So I've never seen it, but who thought we'd be here 2-3 months ago? I don't know.
Exactly. If your landlord has said he would consider, and I don't mean to be sexist, so he or she would consider temporarily reducing my rent if I provide proof my income has gone down due to COVID. Is it an okay idea to share my bank account details and unemployment benefits statement with my landlord? ?
Yeah, so I would say, please don't share your bank statement with your landlord. That's not his business. As I said, we're advising people to do a very simple letter saying either I'm on unemployment benefits or I've suffered a COVID-related financial hardship. Whether or not you feel comfortable sharing proof of your unemployment insurance benefits with your landlord is going to have to do with how you feel about your relationship with your landlord. There might be some landlords where you feel comfortable that you're not sharing private information that your landlord will use against you. But the tenant who's living in this situation probably has a better idea of whether or not their landlord is someone who this information could be shared with. But reminding your landlord that there are all these protections, including the new safe harbor, might bring the landlord to a table to make a deal.
Okay. And what about if you have a big management company? Are there different ways to approach this whole situation if it's not like a landlord that but it's a large management company with an office that you go and talk to pay rent? Yeah, the rules really don't change, do they?
Absolutely not. And, people deal with large management companies who are very professional and thoughtful and treat people well, and people deal with large management companies who treat people terribly. And so think about your experience with the management company and how they have addressed problems that have come up in the past, and that would probably tell you the best way to approach them.
And actually, the question was written in the context of what options should my apartment management office be offering to help? I've not heard from them at all. I don't think there's any obligation for them to volunteer options to help. That would be lovely, but I don't think so, right?
Yeah. So one would think that a management company or a landlord would need to be a good business person to make a lot of money. Unfortunately, in the New York market, you can be a terrible business person and own real estate and make a lot of money. And because of that, so I think that someone who is a good business person might want to work with their tenants to come up with a deal that makes sense for both of them, because we're all in this crisis together. But there are a lot of really bad business people out there who own real estate and may not see that it's in their interest to do it. And there's nothing to obligate them to do it.
One from Facebook. Can I break a lease due to developing COVID-19 and losing my job and not being able to pay the rent? And what would be the best way to do that?
Yeah.
I'm willing to pay, but my hours are going to be cut down, so I can't possibly pay all of it.
So, I mean, just to take a step back from before last year. Before last year, if you broke your lease in the middle of your lease term, your landlord had no obligation. You were obligated to pay rent till the end, and your landlord had no obligation to find a new tenant to put into the apartment. But in a great part of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act actually requires landlords to try to lessen their damage, to mitigate their damages by finding a new renter. And if they don't do that, the tenant isn't obligated to pay. So normally in the New York City market, what I tell people is that the likelihood that the landlord will be able to find a tenant to put in your place is really high. During COVID, I don't know that that's true. And so your landlord may search high and low and be really diligent when trying to find a tenant to replace you, and he may not or she may not be able to. And so my recommendation in these situations where people are breaking leases is it might make sense, again, to try to make a deal with your landlord and try to get something in writing in which you are agreeing to surrender the apartment by such date, and you're paying this amount of money, and that the landlord agrees to accept your surrender, and that your lease is over. But again, everything you do with your landlord, get it in writing.
Right. All right. Government assistance for tenants struggling to pay the rent. Are there any grants being offered to pay the rent or utilities?
So nothing new other than this new program, which is frankly quite small, that was just announced yesterday and hasn't been set up, and I don't know what the rules are. There's HEAP, which is a program through the state to help people pay utility costs. It's HEAP. And there is what's known as a one-shot deal to help people who can't pay their rent pay arrears. What's a little bit complicated with applying for one-shot deals right now is that usually you need a court case to begin your application for the one-shot deal. You also need to show the city that you have a future ability to pay, both of which might be difficult right now.
Right. So, I'm sorry. People should still apply because the HRA has been expanding the kinds of assistance they can provide and loosening the rules around things. So I think that if people know about one-shots and think that maybe they fit into that category, I would suggest they at least give it a shot. I believe we've also have technically a moratorium on having to pay utility bills for now. So the same discussion we've been having about a moratorium on evictions, there's also state language about moratorium on having to pay your utility bills, which again doesn't mean you won't owe them, but it means they can't come and turn off your lights and water, which is also very important. So I'm glad that got asked as rent and utilities. The next question is any assistance available for tenants in NYCHA or Section 202 buildings whose income has gone down due to the pandemic? And isn't
Yes,
the good news, if your income goes down in these buildings, what you owe in rent goes down automatically?
it's yes. There's good news. They need to reset your rent. If you're in a 202, you need to contact your management. Um, New York City Housing Authority has been slow to come up with a process to help public housing residents reach out and get their rent redetermined. We think that that may be up and running now through calling CCC. The other thing to know is that if you are receiving in either 202 or public housing, if you are receiving unemployment insurance benefits and you're receiving the extra $600 a week in pandemic federal benefits, none of that will be counted toward determining what your new rent is. It's blind.
Thank you. I was asked to move my cell phone because it was vibrating. Sorry about that. That's what happens when you're doing things live. Things can go wrong. Um, if your lease was set to end at the beginning of July and it went for renewal, but you have not received your unemployment benefits, and the new lease says they are raising your rent, what should you do? So you still haven't signed your new lease yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you should use your best judgment if you're rent regulated, even if you're not, and see if you can negotiate something. I would, it would be very helpful, obviously, to you if you understood whether or not you were going to receive your unemployment insurance benefits. I know that your Senate office, I know that a lot of elected offices are spending a lot of time helping people get unemployment insurance benefits. Legal Aid Society also has a hotline to help people, and people should feel free to reach out.
So I mentioned this before, but I'll repeat it again because the question was that they had read that there's a $3 trillion stimulus bill passed by the House that would provide assistance for renters. And the question is, will the Senate pass this too? And as I explained before, we're all lobbying very hard to urge the U.S. Senate to pass this bill. Our two U.S. Senators, Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand, are totally in favor of this bill. Unfortunately, they are minority members of the U.S. Senate, and so it's going to take a huge amount of effort by people in states with red senators as well as blue senators pushing for this additional stimulus package, which frankly, every week that goes on with the economy continuing to plummet and the pandemic popping up in states that hadn't seen it yet, we see more and more need for this as a national response, and hopefully that will trigger the Senate to pass the bill the House passed. But we can't guarantee that, which is why we're all working very hard to keep the pressure on them to pass exactly the bill I described, which would have, I know 10 billion sounds like a lot of money to any of us, but in the realm of the federal budget and the money they can make available, 10 billion towards New York's housing crisis isn't that big of an amount for them, and is the difference between, I fear, chaos and getting through this for us. So if you have friends in states with red senators, urge them to tell them to do the right thing and pass this national bill.
I would just say
Yes.
that I agree that all of our federal elected officials are part of this bill, but it's a $1 trillion bill that has a lot of things for a lot of people. And we need to make sure that our federal electeds, as they negotiate this bill going forward, make housing a priority. And so I urge everyone listening to reach out to your elected official and to our senators to make sure that they understand that as negotiations go on, they need to prioritize rental assistance. And the bill also would provide operating assistance to public housing. So it's actually broader in terms of rental assistance that exists.
Thank you. You're absolutely right. All right, the Screen Dree program. Have they been impacted in any way by the pandemic? Are there any different rules for the Screen Dree programs?
No, they're moving forward.
Okay.
They're working remotely.
Got it. So my lease expires in June. This is a question. and I'm on scree. I haven't done my taxes yet for 2019. Will I lose my scree benefits if I don't recertify right away?
I mean, I would reach out to SCREE and talk to them about how they recommend you do that. You can do that by calling 311. Because the time for filing taxes got moved to July, my guess is that no one is going to be harmed by a late filing. But I always feel like touching base with the agency and just making sure there isn't some form you should file is the best policy.
Moving into building policies. My landlord said I cannot buy my own air conditioner and have it installed because no outside deliveries are allowed, and maintenance people are not going to be allowed in the building. Is this legal?
I think that the question is legal versus practical, right? If you live in a doorman building, I think the doorman probably can stop people from coming in. If the reason you need an air conditioner is that you are disabled and you need air conditioning to help with a physical or medical problem, you should reach out to your landlord and ask for a reasonable accommodation of this policy. The other thing I would say is that I think New York, I think we see that rules are starting to loosen as we get into hotter weather. And so I would go back to your landlord and see, as New York City opens, is there a moment in which you can bring a maintenance person to get your air conditioner?
Variation on the same question. Instead of allowing somebody to bring a air conditioner in and put it in your building, can a landlord prevent tenants from having guests into their apartments due to the COVID rules of the road?
Again, it depends on the type of building and whether you have to have people buzzed up or not. But again, I would say that people should be thoughtful of their neighbors, some of whom might be immune compromised and have reasons why they're particularly susceptible to this disease, and be thoughtful about who's coming in and out of their buildings.
Thank you. While my landlord has urged the wearing of masks in the lobby and common public spaces, not all residents are doing this. Is there a New York City or state mandate requiring this in the lobby, in the elevators, in the mail rooms, in the laundry? If not, why not? Are the building staffs required to wear masks?
I don't think so.
Okay, I think it's more a question for me than you, but no, it's not a law, but there are executive orders that the governor has put out about wearing masks and keeping 6 feet away, but it doesn't say explicitly that you must. The city has been more emphatic in the mayor's constant urging and instructions to people that they must both wear masks and try to stay 6 feet apart. And he's even been using government representatives and police to try to convince people that this is a must. But I don't actually think there's a law that would have us arresting people for not doing it. And I'm not sure any of us want to have a law coming and arresting people for not doing this. But I do think this is an assignment for sort of civic participation and the ability to convince our neighbors that this matters for all of us, and social embarrassment of not doing what one is expected to do in this circumstance. So I think people should just keep coming up with creative ways to message to people why these important practices have just got to be internalized as the rules of the road. And there are quite a few epidemiologists who are now working on messaging models that encourage people to do the smart thing even when they don't necessarily want to. So I know my staff and I have been looking at parallels between, say, when the AIDS crisis exploded on us in the 80s and suddenly safe sex was something that was either going to keep you alive or you were going to die. And yet, like every other effort of abstinence in the whole history of mankind, You can't just say to people, and we're just not having sex anymore, folks, because it can be dangerous. So that there are some epidemiologists who are working on similar messages to help people understand the standards of least risky to most risky and hope to move them sort of on the spectrum to practicing the least risky behaviors. And frankly, at this point, at a minimum, using a mask would be the obvious answer for everyone. So think of that mask like you had to think about condoms back in the 80s. I know some people think that I'm crazy that I just said that, but I actually really do think that is an approach we all need to take to living with COVID, because it looks like we're going to be living with it for a while. Too many people crowd into the elevators in my building. I live in a NYCHA apartment. It's impossible to stay 6 feet away from people. Why hasn't NYCHA put up some signs to try to prevent this? They should. And my staff will contact NYCHA tomorrow and recommend exactly that. And it's you can go into different buildings and see such different practices. Some stores actually have drawn lines on the sidewalk outside to keep you 6 feet apart, waiting to get into the store and waiting at the checkout. And some are clueless about it. Some buildings actually are limiting how many people can be in a elevator at a time. Obviously, NYCHA is unlikely to have staff in the areas in front of the elevators, while some buildings with, say, 32 BJ doormen have people there who then explain, here's the rules of the building, and no more than X number in the elevators together. So again, it's exactly the same issue. How do we educate people to understand why it's in their own best interest to follow some of these new rules of the road? All right, lease renewals. I have heard the city is considering a rent freeze on rent-stabilized apartments for leases beginning in the fall. Since my landlord has not returned the signed lease to me, will I be eligible to have the new lease with a zero increase?
And the answer is no. Just to be clear, I've been seeing a lot of questions about lease renewals. When your landlord sends you a lease renewal and you send it back, that's basically the deal, right? And oftentimes landlords don't send the leases back. If you're a rent stabilized tenant and you don't get your lease back, according to DHCR, you still have to pay the increase. But you can file a form with DHCR asking for a form with DHCR saying that I want my lease back. Just because you haven't gotten your lease back, especially if you're rent stabilized, doesn't mean your landlord can evict you.
Okay, thank you. So there's someone who decided to participate in a rent strike, and they've put aside the rent money for their rent-stabilized apartment rather than paying for April and May. They have a renewal coming up. I can't risk jeopardizing, is what the person said. Can the landlord refuse to renew my lease because I haven't paid yet?
Not if you're rent stabilized. If you're unregulated, yes.
Okay. So this person would be safe because they're rent stabilized. But they also highlight something else that I know that I've always been taught. If you are going to participate in a rent strike, and there's many different reasons people end up in these situations, including when landlords fail to deliver what they're supposed to be delivering, and you're trying to get the attention of them, so groups of tenants may go on rent strikes to try to get the landlord to make the repairs and take care of the things they're supposed to. The important part of this little question here was that they highlighted they've put the money aside. And I will always urge people, if they have the ability to pay the rent, and yet they have made a decision not to pay the rent for some period of time, please, please, please hold that money aside. Don't spend it on something else, People used to talk about escrow accounts. I don't know if anybody still does those, but I just really want to emphasize the dangers
It's
of
behind
not
those.
paying your rent when you can. Sorry, Ellen. Yes.
Completely agree. I completely agree.
Sorry.
Sorry, if you're doing a rent strike, definitely put the money aside so that, yes. I mean, a lot of people are on rent strike because they can't afford to pay.
Right.
And some people are using this idea of a rent strike as a moment of solidarity so they don't feel so alone. But to the extent you're on rent strike and have the money, keep it aside.
So this is another one for someone who lives in a rent-stabilized apartment. My landlord sent me a lease renewal by mail 10 days before the lease was due to expire. When does my new lease start? And can a landlord renew a lease by email, or does it have to be done through real mail?
So the answer is the landlord has to give tenants 90 days notice prior for a rent renewal lease. And so assuming that your lease was up May 1st and your landlord sent you the renewal April 20th, your new increase would go into effect in August 1st, which is the first rent payment date after 90 days after you were given the renewal lease. So your increase will be delayed, which is a good thing. The question about email is interesting. No, your landlord is supposed to send you a renewal in mail. But I think what I would say in this moment of time, where a lot of people may not have wanted to actually receive mail, and for some people, email might have been a solution that made a lot of sense in the middle of the health crisis, that the person who's asking the question should consider whether this is something they want to raise with their landlord or not. Sending a renewal lease by email that the tenant did actually receive might have made sense in the moment when it happened.
Okay. So I feel like this is a stump Ellen questions, but we're never going to stump you. I lost my job due to COVID and stopped paying rent in April. I am rent stabilized, but I have preferential rent. My lease expires this week. My landlord mailed the new lease a month ago. I want to renew the lease for at least another year. Can the landlord refuse to sign my lease until I pay the back rent?
No, he cannot. And more importantly, because of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act that was passed last year,
Yes.
The landlord can't take away your preferential rent.
Yes. I knew that answer too, but I wanted to make sure you got to say it here.
I know, it's so exciting.
I know, because that is a really, really crucial issue for so many renters, even before the economic downturn and the pandemic. The sort of exploding, taking advantage of people with preferential rents, and we did change the state law so that can't happen anymore. So,
Yeah.
very happy to hear that. All right, another one. On March 25th, I signed a new rent-stabilized lease that begins July 1. The law provides that the landlord must sign and return a copy of the lease to me within 30 days of my signing the new lease. As of May 23rd, so almost 2 months after they signed, my landlord has not returned a copy of the signed lease to me. Do I get an extension of time during which I pay the old rent until the landlord complies with the 30-day rule?
No, DHCR says that in those circumstances, you need that you have to start paying your increase on the time that the lease commences. And if you have a complaint to DHCR, there's a form you can fill out.
Okay. That was a reasonable ask.
Yeah,
Breaking
sure.
leases. What are the ramifications if I leave my apartment in the middle of my lease? I can't pay the rent. Can I get my security deposit back?
So again, we talked about the issue of landlords trying to mitigate their damages. So the ramifications are that you may still be required to pay rent. Now, again, back to the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, part of the law that was passed actually increased protections for tenants with their security deposits. In that law, it's pretty clear that the only reasons the landlord can withhold the security deposits have to do with damage to the apartment or unpaid utility costs. It says nothing about breaking your lease early. I'm sure that a landlord will try to argue that this has caused great economic damage, and therefore they should be able to keep the security deposit. It's probably going to be a matter where you're going to have to go to small claims court and try to fight for your security deposit. But I think there's a good argument that you should get it back. To the extent you don't, the place to complain to is the Attorney General's office.
Okay. So I'm going to read you two questions together because they really are getting at the same thing, even though they're variations on the same question. So first, and I hear about this in my office all the time, many senior citizens who live in rent-stabilized apartments have been sheltering outside the city to stay safe and healthy during the pandemic. How will the 6 months and a day New York City residency be handled if they have to shelter longer away from the city? Then variations, I'm a rent-stabilized tenant, but I'm currently staying in Georgia, taking care of my 90-year-old parents during this crisis. Can the landlord evict me if I don't meet the primary residency requirements because I am needed by my parents out of state?
So the issue around rent-stabilized tenants not having their lease renewed because they do not use their apartment as their primary residence it's part of the law. But all of these situations, I'm somewhere because of my health, or I'm somewhere because of my a relative's health, have always been found to be excuses for people not living in their apartments. I mean, you need to show that you intend to return. But because the law is really good on this, and because this is a crisis that particularly affected New York City, we were at the epicenter, I fully expect that judges will understand people's excuses on why they sheltered in place outside of New York City, or why they had to take care of relatives in other parts of the country. And I think people will be protected and be able to stay in their rent-stabilized apartment. I would not worry.
All right, we're going to go on to building maintenance and appliance issues, but I'm going to sort of keep it to the ones that are COVID related. Given that all these things are going wrong for everyone, and we're making lots of exceptions because of the pandemic and the crisis, is there any exception for landlords about doing conventional repairs during this time? For instance, the water faucet isn't working, the windows are breaking, there's leaking rain. Do landlords get off the hook for their responsibilities because we're going through a pandemic?
No, but what's complicated is there are some tenants who want landlords to come into their apartment to make repairs, and some tenants who don't. And when we're talking about repairs that aren't an emergency, certainly your landlord is still obligated to provide you with housing that is safe and habitable. To the extent your landlord says to you, I cannot because, my maintenance worker is sick, or I cannot do this at this moment, I do think the courts would be sympathetic to that argument, especially as we reopen, if your landlord then agrees to make the repairs. It's a different story if it's an emergency repair. The courts actually, although the courts were closed, if you had an emergency repair, no hot water, no heat when it was still cold, and cascading leak, for example, those things, tenants continue to be able to bring cases against their landlords, even in this emergency, in order to get those things repaired.
And a reverse question, I think you touched on it. So do I have to let building staff into my apartment to make non-emergency repairs? I'm a senior citizen. I'm very concerned about interacting with as few people as possible. And so because I am sort of quarantining at home, do I have the right to say, no, you can't come in?
Yeah, I think that it's entirely reasonable if you are afraid of letting strangers into your home because you think you are particularly susceptible to the illness, that anyone would consider that to be a completely reasonable excuse. Again, to the extent you can put that in writing to your landlord, so that you can show you did everything possible to try to work with your landlord, I think that's reasonable. And I think, again, unless what's going on in your apartment is an emergency, if it's just a routine repair, I think that's reasonable.
Is my landlord required to provide me with a working air conditioner? I live in a rent-stabilized apartment and mine broke.
If the air conditioner was there when you moved in, then your landlord has to continue your lease and your tenancy on the same terms and conditions as when you entered the apartment. And so if your landlord provided you with their working air conditioner and yours breaks, they have to repair it. To the extent you brought it in and you just like your landlord to replace it, they would not have to. But if it was part of the apartment when you moved in, the landlord has to keep those parts of the apartment working.
So can a landlord require me, I'm a rent-stabilized tenant, to remove my air conditioner from the window and then tell me I have to buy a wall unit from their supplier if I want to have air conditioning?
I think I would need more information. I mean, there are some situations where having an air conditioner in the window is dangerous, and to the extent that the landlord can show that that is dangerous, a court might be sympathetic to a landlord saying you have to do that. You might, if you're a rent-stabilized tenant, you've always had the air conditioner in your window, and the landlord's now making you buy one from his. This might be a good complaint for DHCR, the state agency, because if he's changing like the terms of your lease and making you spend money on a new air conditioner, that might not be allowed. But I think I need more information before I could give a definitive answer.
I think we're getting to a very basic question. I believe the warrant of habitability has been violated in my apartment. Will the city or state inspectors hold the landlord responsible, or am I going to have to take them to court?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so when people talk about warranty of habitability, often what they mean is they want a rent abatement, but sometimes what they mean is they think that there are housing code violations in their apartment, and they want it on record that that's what's going on. To the extent you want a rent abatement, it is usually up to you to pursue them. The one way to do it if you are rent stabilized is to file a diminution of service complaint with HCR, which could end up having you pay somewhat less until your landlord makes the repairs. But it tends to be, especially with the low increases that people have seen, it tends to be not a huge discount on your rent. But to the extent that what you really want is the repairs to be done, you can always call 311. Right now, unless it's an emergency, they are probably not sending housing inspectors out because that could put people in danger. But once this crisis is lifted, you can always call 311 and have a housing code inspector come to your apartment and put violations on your landlord's building, which would put them on notice that they need to make repairs.
Thank you. All right, now we're spreading out into other rent-regulated questions that may or may not relate to the pandemic. Oh no, this definitely does. I live in a rent-stabilized apartment and have always paid my rent by check. My landlord signed a notice stating that due to the pandemic, rent can only be paid by credit card or bank transfer. Is this legal?
No. No.
So.
There was actually a bill passed by the Senate and the Assembly saying no. Also, to the extent landlords are asking people who cannot afford to pay their rent to take out credit cards to pay their rent, please don't do that. the interest rates on those credit cards are very, very high. Tell your landlord it's illegal. Continue to pay the rent the way you have.
Thank you. What is being done to combat the New York Court of Appeals decision that struck down portions of the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which allowed tenants to challenge rents and deregulations that took place more than 4 years ago?
There is it's a series of cases that invalidated parts of the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. In two of those cases, the plaintiffs have sought a ruling from the court to try to narrow the decision. They're trying to ask for reconsideration. The Legal Aid Society and Legal Services NYC have filed an amicus brief supporting that motion. So that's what's being done at the court level. There's also conversations being had with the original sponsors of that bill about whether there's bill language that could be introduced and passed that would narrow the decision in some way to provide some relief to tenants who've been harmed by it.
And I guess a variation. So in trying unsuccessfully to negotiate with my landlord for a no increase renewal lease, I discovered my apartment was previously rent stabilized, and I was the first tenant who moved in after it was deregulated in 2004. Is there a statute of limitations to challenge the status of my apartment?
So what's a little bit complicated there is after the decision in Regina Metro, some of these things are up in the air. And what's particularly complicated in that situation is that your landlord could have legally deregulated your apartment in 2004 after a vacancy if the landlord had done enough individual apartment improvements in the apartment to get the apartment to be over 2000. And the question of whether the landlord did that in 2004 usually requires discovery. But because of what happened with Regina Metro, being able to get discovery unless you can show that your landlord used a illegal scheme to deregulate, fraudulently used an illegal scheme to deregulate the apartment is going to be difficult. And without discovery, it is going to be hard to do the case. The other thing is that so all is to say is the Court of Appeals decision that came down will make proving your case more difficult.
So jumping back into COVID. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been a number of thefts of delivered packages in buildings. Yes, I'm hearing that all the time because everybody's having everything delivered because they're trapped in their apartments. What are the landlord's responsibilities and obligations in these cases, especially if they've been notified that packages are being stolen?
I mean, I think it's complicated, right? It also depends on the type of building. I don't know that I think a landlord is required to hire a security officer if it's a non-doorman building. Certainly the landlord is required to provide very basic security measures, and if he doesn't, and if you lose a package, you could possibly sue the landlord for damages. Whether or not doing that type of case would be worth it to you, and whether or not that under the circumstances a court would hold the landlord responsible, I don't know. Certainly, I think asking your landlord to add some security measures under these circumstances is reasonable, but this is a difficult situation.
It is. It is. I don't think this is your question, but I will give it a shot. With all the retail vacancies, are there any possible plans to turn stores into apartments? Would this require zoning changes? I would say in many cases it would require zoning changes, and it would require a landlord to actually want to move from commercial to residential, and usually that would be first floor on avenues. I don't know, Ellen, if there's any reason you would have experience with that
None. I would
change.
also think that there needs to be a change in the certificate of occupancy.
I think so too. So it's
Yeah.
pretty complicated to go through that process, but you might want to check with your city council member if you are exploring it in some specific neighborhood or Department of Buildings, but I don't think it's so easy to do.
Right. Although I would say that not commercial space, well, sort of commercial space, but the Woolworth building went from, having offices to a residential co-op. It's
Hmm.
doable, but it's, I think, the only building I've heard that has done that.
Right. Thank you. And we're getting down to the end of time and the end of questions. Um, can you explain what the laws are regarding Airbnb and residential apartments in New York City?
You can, can't you?
I think I can, but
Yes, I do.
although, so in fact, you are not allowed to rent out an apartment for less than 30 days under New York City law, and and you cannot have a rent regulated, rent stabilized, rent controlled apartment or a public housing apartment and turn it into an Airbnb unit. You can't not live there. You have to be living there while you're having guests. There's my office. If you call my office tomorrow or you email my office, we have really excellent materials available that we can forward to you about what the rules of the road are in Airbnb residential apartment use in New York City. I do know that one of the realities of the pandemic, because people really aren't traveling and people really aren't wanting to live someplace where they're not sure about the cleanliness and who was there before or after, just like we're seeing the hotels emptying out. I think that there has been a plummeting in the use of Airbnb by anyone at this point in history, but we're happy to get you those materials. Just feel free to reach out to my office. We have plenty of materials. So I guess the final question to you, Ellen, tonight. What do you think the most effective ways are to support tenant advocacy and efforts taking place to address the eviction crisis, the moratorium, the possibilities of canceling rent? Who would you suggest that people reach out to?
Housing Justice for All. There's a website. Legally, it's part of Housing Justice for All. A lot of the community tenant groups are. It's a statewide housing justice organization. We did a lot of work last year to get the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act passed, and we are continuing to work with tenants, support tenants in the crisis that's happening. Go to the website, and that's how I would recommend people participating.
Great. You know what? One more came in that I just missed. Let's try to throw this in from Facebook. Must all building renovations include a ramp if the building only has stairs in the lobby, according to the American Disability Act? Can they renovate without addressing the needs of the handicapped?
Yes. So the issue of whether or not a building has to put a ramp in instead, together with stairs in various parts of the building is a very building by building specific question of costs versus how costly it is. And for some buildings, it's prohibitively costly and the landlord isn't required to do it. And for some buildings, it just makes sense. My recommendation for people who are trying to get their landlord to put in a ramp is to reach out to the New York City Human Rights Commission, who understand the rules probably better than anyone else in the city and can help tenants negotiate those sort of questions with their landlord.
Thank you. So now you all know why Ellen Davidson is in enormous demand to come to presentations back when we got to see each other in person, in auditoriums, answering questions like this. And now I think she probably spends almost every night of her life on different Zooms doing these Q&As because she really does know all the answers. So Ellen, I want to thank you so much on behalf of my district for sharing your time and expertise with us tonight. I want to let everybody watching know that this will remain on Facebook and that you can continue to go and watch it whenever you wish, or to tell other people that it might be a helpful resource for them. Again, next Thursday, June 4th at 7 p.m., we're going to have the second half of the series on housing, and I will be joined by attorneys Kevin McConnell and Rose Marie Cantano, who will discuss many of the questions and concerns currently facing co-op shareholders, condo owners, and homeowners. Again, everyone stay safe, stay healthy. We're going to get through this together. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.